Claire, and I will be going through the first 3 chapters of border security. The first 3 chapters really just go over the basic information that anyone would need to have the conversation about border security. The first chapter is going to be about the definitions of borders, boundaries, and barriers, the different types, the economic, geographical, oceanic, economic borders that countries and the land itself has created for us. Next, we're going to go into the history of borders, boundaries, barriers, and security, meaning it would be the different types of historical boundaries that we have seen, like the Great Wall of China, Maginot's Line, a lot of different ones like that, and we can bring it back into the correlation of Trump's Wall in modern day conversations. Understanding the importance of the definitions of borders, boundaries, and barriers, as well as a historical look at borders, boundaries, and barriers, it can be extremely helpful when discussing current day border security. Now, a lot of things have changed from the building of the Great Wall of China until present day, but the same concept is still there in the uses of walls and the different types. The last chapter, which is going to be the 3rd chapter, is going to be the history of border security and border patrol agencies. That just really focus on where border patrol agencies began and where they lie today. You'll see a lot of common denominators and how the increase in border security has made leaps and bounds ever since 9/11 and previously during the 90s. The difference that we see from the 90s until now and the great lengths that we have gone through and we've gone to in securing our borders. Border security is one of the most important things. It's a topic that is very hot right now. I think it will always be a topic of conversation, especially since 9/11. I mean, 9/11 was one of the biggest security breaches of our borders that we have ever seen. So since then, we see this huge increase in the way we talk about borders, the way we want to work with borders, how we work with foreign agencies to protect even just our borders. So we're going to go through all of these different things and we'll get down to the discussion. And then I'm going to pose a question to you is after learning all of these things, what does that mean? What is the next step for border security for our future? Where do we go from here? There's a lot of conversations about it's not just land, it's air, it's tunnels, it's ocean. We have all these different means of border security risks that we need to look at the past to be able to understand. So let's get started. Now, the first chapter is going to be about, as I said, the definitions of borders, barriers, and boundaries. A barrier is an object that blocks or is used to block passage. It could be a natural formation, it could be a man-made formation. The barrier itself doesn't specifically have to be a natural one, but that's what we see most common. We see that with the geographical types of barriers is going to be your mountain ranges. It's going to be your rivers, your lakes, your deserts, things of that nature, which is really what the bulk of geographical barrier, and that's what we really see as a barrier. In modern days, when we're talking about barriers, a lot of the conversation will be of fences. In Trump's era, Trump's presidency, it's of the wall. So that's going to be just your general idea of what a barrier would be. Now, the next is going to be a boundary. Now, a boundary is anything that has a fixed limit or has an extent. So it is your boundary is from here to here. This is your boundary. With that, it's a lot that we talk about with boundaries is the boundaries of lines of states and countries. The next is going to be a border. The border is an outer part or edge, perimeter or rim, commonly used to denote national and political boundaries. So again, even in the term of a border, we have boundaries in it. And again, that is just mainly for the national, more of a political usage. Now, we're going to go into geography, and the way that borders, barriers, and all that sort of things kind of negate. We did kind of just touch on it, but all it is going to be the naturals. Now, the Himalayan mountains are going to be the natural barrier between China and Pakistan. The Himalayan mountains is one of the largest mountain ranges that we see, and it also had provided a protection around several other countries that made it hard for other countries to enter it. Up until modern day, with technology, that we were able to have communication with these. But the Himalayan mountains really protected these groups of individuals and really protected each state and provided that natural barrier to prevent any trade. A lot of it happened with trade, protection from invasions or anything like that. You will see that the Himalayan mountains, there is certain sections within it that was used for the silk trade. Today, that same line, that same route that was used during the silk trade is still prevalent today. It's actually one of the only access points through the Himalayas from Pakistan to China. And it's because the Himalayas are just it's a different type of atmosphere. It's a different type of climate. It's a different type of range that not a lot of people can cross over because of how difficult it can be. And even in today with planes, we don't see that. There are few paths that planes are allowed to cross over the Himalayas. And it's just because the climate's different, the weather changes, all these sort of things, that it's not just a natural land barrier, but it is also in the sky. I mean, it provides so much protection, and it provides such a limited capacity to travel over through all of these different things. So it really makes an extensive barrier for China and for Pakistan. Now, the next is we're going to go talk about the Pyrenees Mountains. Now, that's the barrier between France and Spain. It's one of the main things that broke up these two countries. It is the main thing that has kept these two countries being their own individual paces. I mean, even because of the Pyrenees Mountains, between those two countries is a huge language difference. Now, if the Pyrenees Mountains was not there, we might see more of a similar fashion or similar language between the two. But because of these mountain ranges, it really has broken up these two countries to be their own separate entities. The Alps protect Switzerland. It has for years, hundreds of years. It really blocked Switzerland off from modern day. It protected Switzerland. It is one of the main barriers around Switzerland that has protected it for so long. Next, we're going to go kind of into North and South America. And generally, with the North and South America is the oceans. The oceans are what protects us. It's a huge, vast thing, really, that protects us from foreign countries. And even so with South America, on both the Atlantic and the Pacific side, there is a huge protection around these countries. And specifically for us, I mean, when we look back in history, how many times have we come to the conclusion that we were invaded or we had a major attack via the ocean to our land? That doesn't happen. I mean, the last time it happened was during the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, all these types of things. And then in modern day, all we really have is Pearl Harbor. And I mean, it's protected us for so long, and it's this natural barrier that we have that there's only what, 4 or 5 instances of being attacked via the ocean or even being attacked by air, because it is so vast that it's hard for another country to go over this land without being detected. I mean, even with Pearl Harbor, it was a little bit known that something was going on, but they attacked Hawaii because that was the closest point of American soil that was there to them. It's not like they were going to hit California, because by the time that they got past a certain point in the ocean, we would be able to tell and be able to prevent it. Another very large mountain range that has protected South American countries is the Andes Mountains. It is one of the largest mountain ranges in South America, and it also connects with the Amazon River. The Amazon River goes through the Andes Mountains. Now, this is a huge division between eastern countries and the western countries of South America, and it is used as a protection. So it's very hard for other countries to cross over the Andes as well as the Amazon River because of how large it is. And again, this is another natural formation that has protected countries from invasion from others. So through history, our geographical barriers are one of the most important when it comes to talking about border security. It is what we naturally have and what we can naturally use that's going to prevent others from entering into our country. It's something that I think needs to be more utilized in the future, and we'll discuss that a little later on in chapter 3 about the usage of these natural barriers and the benefits it could have and the deterrent that it will and can possess. Now, next we're going to go into the political barriers and boundaries. Now, this is just going to be specifically what makes a country, what makes those borders their borders. These usually, the political barriers are going to come from the language, the laws, the way that a country, its uniqueness from other countries. And a lot of goes into, we can see that with, Spain and France, is where that they both have these political barriers because of this mountain range, but also because of their belief system, also because of their language barriers, what divides them from another. With the whole political boundaries is in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire controlled much of Europe. And when that kind of dissolved, these individual states popped up and didn't know how to protect themselves, didn't know, they were under one specific rule by the Pope, that they didn't have any system of their own. So with that, the creation of these individuals coming together and becoming this common community, this society, and from there was laws put into place. There was, the general, how everybody else in that society thought what was right and what was wrong kind of became the headway to creating these laws in this whole entity. Now, there are 2 theories in which explains how a state is identified as a state. What counts a country as a country? What is in place that says, yes, you are a country, we recognize you, other countries recognize you as a state, you're your own entity. And that comes down to the state being recognized by another state. So let's say England recognized France as its own state. So then France became its own state. Because another already established country, state, had then said, oh, well, you're established too, so you're a state. The next is going to be the impact it has. So a state would become a state if it has the necessary rules in place, it has the necessary government in place, it has a natural, or it has the necessary boundaries and borders that kind of divides itself from other specific states. going to go and talk about the oceanic barriers. Now, we kind of just touched on that a little bit with the way the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans has really protected countries. But to go more in depth in that is, do you know what constitutes as what belongs to which country? And that's what we're going to kind of discuss right now. Now, the territorial waters of a country is going to be 12 miles from low tide of a country out. That is going to be the operational, that is their land. That is what they own, these countries own. When we talk about the economic zone, it's actually going to be extending 200 miles from low tide. So that's what the country has control over economically. Now, the boundary of their land is 12 miles from low tide, but their economic zone that they have control over, that they can use for economic reasons, for research, for discovery, for pipelines, for all these different things, is 200 miles. Now, this was created by the UN Convention, and it's going to be the Convention of the Law of the Sea. This was discussed, and it's still obviously very present today. And then the next is going to be our economic barriers and boundaries. Now, this is a little bit tricky, just based on it's because of a country's economic policies, their tariffs, their taxations, their prohibitions, all those different things go into what constitutes the economic boundary. A lot with that is we see a lot of these like treaty agreements, specifically NAFTA, between Canada, Mexico, and the US, that has really laxed the economic barriers, so the taxation's kind of been relaxed. And even in today's political world, we talk about how we want to increase taxation, we want to increase tariffs on different countries, especially China, because a lot of our, products are being made in China and being imported over here. And President Trump had said that, he wants to put more of a taxation, more tariff on that, because then it would bring more of these factory jobs back to America, because the taxation would just be so high on these different products. We see a lot with the globalization of the world has really made an impact on the economic barriers as well as the actual barriers and borders of a country. Globalization has really changed the way the whole world operates because communication is just so open. The internet, everybody is aware of what is going on in another country. Everybody is connected. There is so much of the world just kind of wrapped together now because of globalization that it's very hard for the distinguishment of borders, barriers, and boundaries. And that's what we're going to see a lot with issues when talking about border security in modern day, is that globalization has made it extremely difficult to properly secure our borders. And that goes into, well, we have this globalization. We have all these things. Everybody is talking to each other. How can we use that to our advantage in creating secure borders? Is globalization going to really harm our borders, or can we use it to our advantage to protect our borders? So we have this basic understanding of what different borders, barriers, and boundaries are, the different types: political, oceanic, economic, and geographical. Next, we're going to kind of transition into the history of these borders, barriers, and boundaries. A barrier has been created to restrict movement, hinder legal crossing, and restricts the free flow of commerce, just as to protect a country's economic area, to protect a country politically, to protect the civilians of the country. With this, with having these protection barriers, and we restrict it so much that it is very hard for trade. It's very hard when we have these boundaries set to have free trade, to have this camaraderie with other countries. Looking through history, the Great Wall of China was built in 2020 BCE, and the main point of it was to keep people out. It was built to keep people out of the Chinese Empire. And over several dynasties of the Chinese history, it is grown and it's become immense. And it's over about 4,000 miles between around China. And it was specifically, the wall was specifically made to keep people out. It was to keep invaders out. A lot of times when invaders are faced with these walls, they have limited choices on how to combat that. Now, there are 5 different types. There is to go under the wall, to go over the wall, to go through the wall, to wait and kind of prevent resources going in so that a country within it doesn't have the resources, so they kind of have to give up. And the last one is retreat. With the Great Wall of China, you can't really go over it, you can't really go under it. So it was an immense barrier for the Chinese Empire, and specifically to this day, has been a very monumental and a huge part of the topic of barriers. Now, obviously today, the Great Wall of China is just more of a tourist attraction than anything. With the globalization and technology advances, there is no need for the wall, because it's not like people are, doing what the Mongolians did and just, kind of go right up to the wall or go right through the country. It's specifically, with modern technology, there's no use for this grand wall because people can fly right over it. You can go around it. There are many things with modern technology that has been able to say, like, the Great Wall of China is not really in use of anymore. So to go from there, during the medieval era, we see a lot of castles and forts being built. These walls around these castles, moats, all of these different things that were used to prevent individuals coming into this area. Through modern times, when the discovery and creation of guns and gunpowder, that significantly changed. It changed due to the fact that there's this newer technology, if you want to call it technology, but it is. There's this newer piece that can blast through these walls, that can go over these walls, that can make much more of an impact. So we kind of gotten away from using walls and these type of barriers and moats and things like that, because there is so much more that has been created. So then we kind of went down to drawing lines on a map, saying this is what this is. In the Revolutionary period and in the Civil War, we still use forts, not for the straight protection of a specific area, but more for the housing, the strategic planning. It's not necessarily meant to be the main purpose of it is to prevent incursions. That's not what it was used for. It's used for different methods. And we see there's this change throughout history from the uses of walls and the uses of moats and these different types of things, and the way, we got away from it. And then during World War II, we kind of made this comeback from them. After the Treaty of Versailles, France was very worried about Germany and what Germany might do after the stipulations that had been put on them for the Treaty of Versailles. Now, as we know, the Treaty of Versailles really just bashed down Germany and really took a hit. So France had created Magnot's Line. Now, Magnot's Line is a probably about 3 to 6 mile stretch. It differs that greatly because there are several different lines. So over this 3 to 6 mile radius, there's 3 different blockades. The beginning blockade is just a simple wall. It's a bunch of fort houses, stuff like that. The second line is going to have more of your mobile weaponry, where more of you have your soldiers staying. The third line is going to be more of the tanks that can move forward. The problem with the wall, Magnot's Wall line, is that it came about in a time where France didn't have the money to spend. So the line was never actually finished. It was supposed to be across the whole border between France and Germany. That did not happen. And no offense to France, but it was a huge failure. The reason for that is the invasion of Germany into France. The line really didn't do much of anything because Germany, as history says and tells, went right around Magnot's Line. So complete failure. And maybe that's due to not having enough resources to extend that line. We don't really know, but it was a pretty bad failure, to say the least. Now, Germany also had their own line, Siegfried's Line, that was between Germany and its borders with France and towards Russia. Siegfried's line was similar to Magnot's. It was just this straight line, and it did work for an extended period of time along France. It did have its benefits. However, towards the end of World War II, when the Allies invaded Germany, I apologize, the Americans and British blasted right through it. So it did have its benefits for an extended period of time, but at a certain point, it was null and void. You know, going back to the 5 reasons or know-hows to get over wall, it's over, under, through it, you wait it out, or you retreat. And the Allies blasted right through it. So as great as an idea as these 2 walls were, they were very much a failure. And a lot of it has to do with the failure of Siegfried's Line, is it didn't have the capabilities to protect for air war. It didn't have these protections if a plane flew over it and destroyed it. And that's what we kind of see, is that these walls and barriers were kind of built with both France and Germany during the same time, but they didn't account for the differences in technology and the way that modern warfare has changed. Next we kind of go into more modern day usage of walls, and specifically Hungary had built a 325-mile fence, a barbed fence, triple layered, all that good stuff, with cameras and all that, to separate themselves from Serbia, and Croatia. Now, the reason that Hungary had did this is that due to the war in the Middle East, a lot of immigrants have been traveling to Hungary to look for safety. And Hungary had been battling with the UN for assistance in making, they need assistance because there are so many people coming in. So they built this fence, and it has worked. It has made an impact on the immigration status. And I think when we look at modern day, towards Trump's wall and the political conversations that we're having today, that, this is an example that could and should be used in the discussion because it has been effective. Now, Saudi Arabia has been building and is building a high-tech fence along its border with Iraq with thermal imaging and battlefield radar in the prevention of ISIS attacks. Lastly, we're going to go through border security within the U.S. and border security agencies throughout history. Now, the Department of Homeland Security is tasked with managing the legal movement of goods and people across the American borders, as well as the protection of the borders from illegal infiltration. Along with that is border patrols. It is the Coast Guards, U.S. Customs. All of these different agencies go into that. Now, Border Patrol was founded in 1924. The agency began within the Department of Labor to prevent illegal immigrants from crossing from over the U.S. and Mexican border. They were previously known as the mounted inspectors. And the reason for that is they were a bunch of men mounted on horses, riding the border lines. Obviously, that has changed, but not by much. Instead of using horses, though horses are still somewhat in use in certain areas, is more so uses of vehicles and drones and different things like that. The Border Patrol are still walking, are still going through the borders, but it is different than being mounted on a horse. During President Roosevelt's presidency, he actually increased the amount of mounted inspectors by quite a bit. And a lot of it was due to immigration, but also for the protection of forests and making sure that those are A-okay. Now, during the Prohibition in the 1920s, we see that Border Patrol really made a huge impact, specifically when speaking between the Canadian and U.S. border as well as the Mexican-U.S. border. A lot of our alcohol came down from Canada into the U.S., and that is where we see a huge influx during that era of patrols being actually on the Canadian border. Whereas prior to that, it was specifically more towards the Mexican border, but we see a lot of the increase in Border Patrol agents in the northern hemisphere due to the Prohibition. During World War I and II, we saw a lot of individuals immigrating into the U.S. And at the time, it was kind of copacetic that it was okay because we had so many young males being drafted, so many young males going into the war, that we needed some sort of able-bodied workers to continue making the economy grow and continuing with the economy. And part of the Deportation Act of 1929, it was authorized that the Mexican workers to be shipped back across the border. Between 1929 and 1939, about 500,000 Mexicans were returned to Mexico. Also during this time, Border Patrol funding was cut dramatically. It never really gave as to why, but there was, towards the end of the era, the resurgence in Border Patrol and border security due to the increase of threats from Germany, Russia, Cuba, all of these different countries that we had a real threat. Next, I'm kind of going into the discussion of different operations that were conducted from Border Patrol agents and the trying to protect the border between ourselves and Mexico. Now, a lot of these operations are specifically with the border between Mexico. There is limited on the border between us and Canada. Now, a lot of the reason for the lack of border control with Canada is that there's a lot of natural barriers, forestries, lakes, the Great Lakes, rivers that have really made it difficult to go from Canada to the US to Canada. And there are points of entry, but in between those points of entry is a lot of natural barriers. That's why, and a lot of our significance with the discussion of, border security is a lot of it has to do with keeping certain individuals out. I mean, that is the main throughout history, building walls, using all these natural barriers is to keep individuals out. Now, with Canada, we don't have or see that much of a threat because, well, Canadians like Canada, and we'll just leave it at that. The economy is doing very well. Their social structures, their policies that they have in place make it so that a lot of Canadians do not want to leave. Their government and their economy is flourishing, so there isn't a reason to leave, unlike South American countries and Mexico where their economies are suffering, where they don't have a lot of opportunities. There's not a lot of jobs. A lot of it has to do with drug cartels and the danger that these people live in. And South America specifically, in a lot of the countries, Chile, Venezuela, they have a lot of crime and they have a lot of reason to want to leave. Back onto the history of border security. So in 1954, Operation Wetback was put into place. This is a system of tactical control and cooperation between the U.S. Border Patrol agents as well as the Mexican government. Teams of agents were equipped with proper tools with being locating, processing, and deporting illegal Mexicans. The goal was quick processing, quick deportation. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. It happens, you're done. That's what it was. Within the first year, 1 million captures were made. 50,000 were returned to Mexico, and in terms of apprehension, it was a success. The longevity and hope of reduction in illegal immigration, it was not successful. And again, this is something that we're going to see throughout the other course of these different operations that we're going to go through, is that it is successful at one point, or it is successful in one sort of faction. However, the longevity of it doesn't do success. And we'll kind of go through that and we'll talk about the pros and cons of each. Now, with the Border Patrol, there are 9 border sectors within the southeast of the U.S. It is San Diego, Tucson, El Paso, Rio Grande Valley, and several others. But we're just going to focus on those. Operation Blockade was in 1993. Now, a lot of these operations are going to be in the 90s. And again, throughout history, we see this resurgence in Border Patrol agents increasing and the need or the tactical desire to increase border control. So a lot of these operations that we're going to discuss are actually all going to be in the 90s prior to 9/11. Now, Operation Blockade was a 25 miles between El Paso and Juarez, Mexico. The idea of the operation was that it could be easier to capture illegal immigrants in the wide open than within urban alleys within a city. The operation did reduce the amount of illegals within the El Paso area. However, it shifted the entrance of illegals to another remote location. Now, again, and this was just kind of the start of these operations, but it had its benefits from taking it from these urban areas and kind of shifting it outwards, where it would be easier versus someone coming in, going down an alley, and you might never see them again, or driving a vehicle or hopping into a vehicle once they get into this urban area. So a lot of that has been done. So along with this, we also look at the San Diego sector, which is Operation Gatekeeper. Now, this was fences, long maps, ground sensors, cameras, stadium lighting, triple fencing lines that were over 100 yards from the Pacific Ocean, or it begins at 100 yards into the Pacific Ocean, and it ends 13 miles inland. Apprehension decreased rapidly, and the access of illegals was strongly deterred. Immigrants moved more south for an easier access point. Now, it did work. It did show its benefits. However, it didn't deter illegals. It just sent them somewhere else, which is good for San Diego because it did limit the amount of immigrants coming into their country. But again, it wasn't much of a deterrent factor than it was going into other places. The last operation, which I think is something that we really should focus on in the discussion of future immigration tactics. Now, this was in the Tucson sector, and it was Operation Safeguard. Now, it used the same strategy as Operation Gatekeeper, reducing the access of illegal immigrants into an urban area. But what they did was Tucson, they did these fences, this more modern, and as we talked about in Operation Gatekeeper, there was in the 90s, like, what they were using the stadium lights, the triple fencing, ground sensors, cameras. That is such a advance in technology that they used in border security. I mean, that's one of the first things that I've seen with border security, is kind of generalizing from that. But with Operation Safeguard in Tucson, what had happened was they had built a fence of similar nature, the stadium lights, technologically equipped. But what it also did was connect the urban areas, build this fence around the urban areas, and kind of end in the desert. That natural barrier of the desert, it was hot, it was just the climate there wasn't something that a lot of people could survive. A lot of immigrants wanting to get into Tucson went through the desert. A lot of them died. A lot of them died of heat stroke, dehydration, malnourishment, all of these different things because of the desert's natural barrier. And I think that is a huge, huge, huge aspect that we should be talking about and looking at, is all these other operations were around urban areas. And it did stop the influx of immigrants going into this more urban area. But as in Operation Gatekeeper and Operation Blockade, it kind of sent them to a different location. Whereas Operation Safeguard, it sent them into a natural barrier. We created a physical barrier, man-made barrier, connected it with our natural barrier, and that decreased a lot of immigration. The Bush administration and into Obama's administration, that actually he installed 300 miles along the Mexican border for protection. Now, the U.S.-Mexican border is only about 1,900 miles. So compared to Canada, which is almost about 3,000 miles, 300 miles of fencing is actually a pretty large feat. And I don't think a lot of people actually know that the Bush and Obama administration already started this increase in using fencing, an increase in using walls, vehicle barriers. Talking about border security and the history of border security, we also need to talk about current day border security and border agencies. And unfortunately, as time progresses and technology advances and the smarter agents get, the smarter the smugglers and cartels get. So we see a lot of different usages from these groups, including using tunnels. They will tunnel through below the surface under these barriers, under these walls, and get into the United States. And when talking about these tunnels, it's actually not just a physical tunnel that they're digging, which a lot of them are, but it's also digging into the already established infrastructure of our sewage system that the United States has created. And I know with Trump's walls, he says that he wants it 6 feet under and go as high. But unfortunately, that's not something that can be done because they're going in through our natural infrastructure of our sewage system and our drainage system. So that needs to be examined. A lot of them are using submarines. Cartels have been using submarines to transport drugs into the United States. A lot of these submarines are tiny, filled with mostly cocaine, different types of drugs, with only about 6 people needing to man it. So it's very tiny, but it's working. It is getting into the country. There has been use of drones, been use of hot air balloons. There's been many different tactics that individuals are using to get drugs into the country. Now, that is something that we need to talk about. And this is the kind of question that I'm going to pose to you, at the end of this conversation is, what does our future of border control and border security look like? Through the definitions and through the history of it, we looked at the positive in walls and physical borders, and we looked at the failures of them. And going forward, what does the future of our border security look like? What will make it work? In my personal belief, in going through the chapters, I do not believe that a physical giant wall will work. I think what President Bush and Obama and their administrations have done is build these fences around the modern urban areas, which, if we look back at the Operation Safeguard, Blockade, and Gatekeeper, that actually did work. It limited the deterrence, but it worked. And then when we look at Operation Safeguard, where it actually deterred and used the natural barriers that we have, I think this is a discussion that we need to go into, and it needs to be further investigated because there is something there and there is something beneficial about that. So again, my name is Claire, and I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you really take in consideration the questions and form your own opinions and do your own research on the history. And I hope this gave you a good starting point as to where to go and how to come up with your own belief system and what ideas you have that could actually work for us. Thank you.